All right, we have clarified what the nature of moral reasoning is. It is not about tastes, likes or dislikes. It is not about what preferences happen to be. It's about a moral issue that has to do with right and wrong regardless of our preferences. And the moral issue of abortion comes down to the question, what kind of thing is the unborn? And now we're going to answer that question. And we're not going to turn to the YWCA. We're not going to turn to theology. We're not going to turn to philosophy. We'll do philosophy, very important step, but that comes second. We're first going to answer the empirical question, what kind of thing is the unborn? And for that, we go to the science of embryology. And I'm going to summarize for you what the science of embryology teaches, and I'm going to do it in one sentence. You don't want a 5-page description of embryology, and you don't need it. You need one sentence. Here's your sentence, and it's in your notes. From the earliest stages of development, the unborn are distinct, living, and whole human beings. From the earliest stages of development, the unborn are distinct, living, and whole human beings. Watch what I'm about to do. I am plucking cells off the back of my hand. You don't see these cells, but I just sent a couple of hundred of these puppies hurling to their deaths on the podium up here. These cells, which are known as somatic cells or bodily cells, the stuff we're made of, each of the cells that I just sent hurling to the podium contain my DNA encoding. But not one of you thinks I just committed mass homicide. And there's a reason for that. You understand that these cells that are on the back of my hand are not the way you were when you were an embryo, because these cells are merely part of a larger human being, me. They are not distinct whole living entities the way you were when you were an embryo, the way I was when I was an embryo. There's a difference in kind between each of our bodily cells and the embryonic human beings we once were. That's what the science of embryology teaches us. And let me quote from a few embryology textbooks just to make the point. Keith Moore writes, the zygote is the beginning of a new human being. Human development begins at fertilization, the process during which a male gamete or sperm unites with a female gamete or oocyte to form a single-celled entity called a zygote. Then, T.W. Sadler's Langman's Embryology says, the development of a human being begins with fertilization, a process by which, he says, the sperm from the male and the egg from the female unite to give rise to a new organism, the zygote. In other words, from the very beginning, the kind of thing we are was established. Now, we will have a philosophical debate about how we should value that thing. That's coming in the next session. But the kind of thing each of us was from the beginning is not in dispute, at least as the science of embryology is concerned. In fact, we've known this stuff for a long time. In fact, in the 1930s and 40s, Dr. Alan Guttmacher, who was the president of Planned Parenthood, one of the founders of it, wrote in his book, Life in the Making, that these facts of embryology are so simple and evident that it's amazing that anybody could dispute them. And yet his organization, of course, became the leading advocacy group of elective abortion on demand. In the early 1860s, on the dawn of the Civil War, doctors already understood that what was going on biologically had nothing to do with life showing up only when the mother felt quickening. Rather, we now knew through genetic discoveries that have been made that life was present much, much earlier than that, and already the idea that conception confers life was making the rounds. In fact, there was a crusade by physicians in the 1860s and 70s and 80s to get abortion banned nationwide, and the physicians made it very clear why they were leading this crusade. It wasn't because they were concerned primarily about the safety of mothers. They were doing this because they believed that abortion was the unwarranted destruction of human life. So these facts have been known. In 1981, the U.S. Senate Subcommittee held a hearing on the question, what does science say about the beginning of human life? It was absolutely unanimous when life begins. And the answer was it begins at fertilization. There was no debate about that. Lots of people argued about how we should value that embryo, but that's a different question than what kind of thing is this embryo. That issue was settled. In short, you didn't come from a zygote, you once were a zygote. Let's break down now those 3 points I made, that we are distinct, living, and whole human beings. When I say that from the very beginning we were those things, here's what I mean. We're distinct in that we are different in kind from each cell of our parents. We're different in kind. We're not identical to the cells of our parents. We're living in that, and this is pretty simple, dead things don't grow. Instead, what we see in the embryo is cellular reproduction, the building up of systems and tearing them down, and the embryo in control of its own internal development. Third thing we see, the embryo is a whole being. Here's what I mean by that. Sperm and egg are merely part of a larger human being. They are not themselves whole, organized human entities. They are part of a human being, like a skin cell. An embryo, meanwhile, is a whole living entity where each of its cells are working together to promote the health of the organism itself. That's what we mean when we say the unborn are distinct, living, and whole human beings. As you might imagine, there are some who challenge this. And I'll walk you through the top 5 or 6 challenges to this view that the embryo is a distinct, living, and whole human being. Here's challenge number 1. How can you say that the embryo is a distinct, whole human being when twinning can occur up to 14, even 20 days out from fertilization? Given that embryo can split into 2, how can you say it's a whole living entity prior to the split? That's the argument. How many of you know what happens when you cut a flatworm in half? What do you get? 2 flatworms. Does it follow there was no flatworm prior to the split? By the way, if you think that's a great example, it's not mine. It came from a guy who had a pretty good GPA named Aristotle. But if you cut a flatworm in half, you don't get the conclusion that there was no living thing prior to the split, do you? So it doesn't follow that because the embryo may split or even later recombine, that it wasn't a whole living entity prior to the split. I'll admit that twinning is somewhat of a mystery to us, but does that mean we can't know that the embryo is a whole human being? And by the way, twinning is only a possibility with a very small number of human embryos. Most don't even have the capacity for it. It just with a small number they do. So clearly, even if this argument worked, it wouldn't work for the vast majority. But I think there's something else here that's rather counterintuitive on critics who bring this up. Here's their argument. Because a twin can be formed from an embryo, it's not a whole human being. Well, guess what? A twin can be formed from any one of you in the very near future. We can take one of your skin cells, and through a process we'll talk about in a little bit called somatic cell nuclear transfer, we can vacate a human egg, a female egg, slap your DNA in there, and voila, with chemicals and electricity, we get it reproducing as a cloned human organism. Now, if a clone can be formed from any of us, then are any of us whole living human beings right now, according to their logic? No. I personally take offense that someone would say that if a clone can be made from me, I'm not a whole human being. But clearly it just isn't the case biologically. The second thing people will say is that the high number of miscarriages proves these are not whole living human beings. Nature, it is said to us, seems to be the world's biggest abortionist because we get up to, we're told, 1/3 of all pregnancies ending in spontaneous miscarriage. Therefore, these embryos are not fully human. Therefore, abortion, embryonic stem cell research, no big deal. Even nature isn't acknowledging their validity. Well, a couple of questions here. I don't know how many of you have gone to any third world countries, say India. In many third world countries, as Robert George points out, the infant mortality rate is astronomically high. These children don't live but 3, maybe 4 weeks after birth and they're dead. Does it follow that because they die sooner rather than later, they were never whole human beings to begin with? But here's another issue. How does it follow that because nature spontaneously aborts a living human embryo, that I may deliberately kill one? You see, it doesn't work as a justification for destroying embryos that they might just not live as long as the rest of us. Here's another one. Sperm and egg are alive. Well, sperm and egg are alive just like the embryo's alive. All right, based on what we've already talked about, what flaw do you see in that? What's the flaw in their biology at that point? Precisely. They're confusing parts with wholes. Sperm and egg are what? Parts. Embryo is what? Whole living entity. They're confusing, exactly as you say, parts and wholes. That was a great answer, but not quite good enough to get you a book. You got to take a bigger risk than that. That was safe. This guy went out on a limb, you know. This guy, he gets it, okay? So we've got this confusion of parts with wholes. Now, let me throw a thought experiment out to you, and we'll just see how you do with it. This is Ellen Goodman's thought experiment. She says, okay, you pro-lifers, you say the embryo is a human being, one of us, whole living entity from the beginning. You're in a burning research lab. It's on fire. In the corner up there is a newborn baby. In that corner over there is a vial full of 12 frozen embryos. This building's about to collapse. You got time to save one or the other, but not both. Which one are you going to save? I know what your answer is going to be and what your answer should be, and I know what my answer would be. I'm going for the newborn. We all are. Goodman says, yeah, that's right. There's the proof you don't really believe the unborn at the embryonic stage are full human beings. Because if you did, you wouldn't automatically go for the newborn, thereby proving that even you, in your deepest intuitions, know that that embryo is not fully one of us, because look who you saved first. So why are you bellyaching about embryonic stem cell research and early abortion? Okay, that's her argument. Anybody want to take a shot at what's wrong with this?
She only gave us one option. It doesn't follow that they're both not human. If you only gave us one option to save one life.
It doesn't prove that the embryos aren't human. It's not scientific. It's ridiculous.
I'd ask if, I don't know if she has kids or not, but I mean, if her child was on one side of the room and there were, say, 1,000 people she had no clue, who would she save?
Yeah. Precisely. Yeah. If this building's on fire and I have a choice of saving all of you or my 9-year-old daughter Emily, who's going to roast? You're gone. I like you all, but you're toast. Even my staff is going to roast, okay? That's just the way it is. And by the way, they'd make me roast if it were reversed. So, we have equal affection here. If this room's on fire, I'm saving my own kid first. Does it follow the rest of you are not fully human? No. Now, by the way, I'm going to save my own kid first, but I'm not going to slit all your throats on the way out, am I? You see, her analogy doesn't work to justify destructive embryo research, because her analogy is about who we're going to choose to save, not who we're going to choose to deliberately kill to benefit someone else. She's using an analogy that doesn't work to prove her point. But you're exactly right. Our emotions and our duties to some human beings are going to be different than others, but it doesn't mean those left behind are not fully human. And you're right, too. It doesn't follow that anything at all to refute the scientific case.
That's the nature of a paradox, because instead of a child and a vial of embryos, if you have 2 children,
Right.
you would have to make an unpleasant choice.
You'd have to make a
And
choice.
so that's one of those paradoxes. It really doesn't seem to have a good answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you still beat your wife? It's the same kind of thing.
Yeah, he sets you up for.
I don't know if it's quite like that, but yeah. That.
What if she's asking more of like, what in that context, what's more valuable? You know what I mean? And like, obviously, what's more valuable to you is your daughter over,
Right.
you know, us or whatever. So if
Right.
we're talking only that context,
Yeah.
what's more valuable of like a born child or these embryos?
I'm glad you brought that up. Very good on your part. Now, here's what's interesting. Why is this even a dilemma for us, this example of hers?
Because they bring it up.
It is, but I mean, in the context of the dilemma here, why is it a dilemma?
Because emotional attachment. Yeah, you see it. You already have the kid there. People can't connect with an embryo in a tube or whatever form it's in. There you have to have a child that's different.
Okay.
Kind of sounds like a paraphrase of the ethical theory question about when I don't know the train track thing where, a train's coming down, there's
Right.
attractive urges, and you can let it hit 5 people, or you flip the switch and let it hit 1.
Depends who the one is.
Yeah. And so it's just kind of, they force you to make a decision, instead of trying to, typically, most people say they try to save the 5 because, every,
You're right.
saving more human life.
You're
It's
right.
more valuable.
Let me clarify. I'm being a little vague at what I'm after here. It's not your fault, it's mine. All right, let's say it's a pot of flowers over here and a newborn over here. Do we have a dilemma? There's no dilemma. Why do we have a dilemma between the vial of embryos and the newborn? They're both valuable. In other words, her example works against her. Because the only reason we pause and go, uh-oh, what do we do is what? They both are valuable. Now, there are prudential reasons why you save the newborn. Its suffering is greater, for one. Also, its chances of survival are better. Medical staff make triage decisions all the time. This is done. In fact, a friend of mine told me a story. I still don't understand it. Well, maybe I do understand it. Apparently, when he was training to be a diver in one of the branches of the armed services, I don't remember which, they taught him, or they had this setup where there's a daughter and a father submerged in a car 18 feet below the water, or 20 feet below the surface of the water, and you're the diver going down to rescue, and the question was put to the guys, who are you going to save first? Guess what the answer is? They go for the dad, because they think the girl's chances are almost nil at that point. Her lung capacity can't survive that. He can. They save him first. Now, does that mean they're immoral? No, they're doing what they think is the greatest good they can in that situation. So that could be in play here as well. All right? Here's another example about things people say when they try to discount our view that the unborn are fully human from the beginning. They'll say things like, well, the embryos are just clumps of cells. They're just clumps of cells. That's all they are. Dr. Maureen Kondik has a great illustration of why that argument does not work. She's a neuroscience professor at the University of Utah, and she has what is a rather morbid example, but I think it gets us right to the heart of where we need to be. She says, imagine that we're here and they wheel into this room right now, into this lecture hall, a corpse who's been dead 4 hours. Does that corpse have live cells on its body? Tons of them. Lots of them. In fact, Dr. Kondik points out, there doesn't appear to be a whole lot of difference between a corpse a few hours after death and a few hours before. But something fundamentally has changed, such that we say the corpse is just, at this point, clumps of cells. But why don't we say the embryo is clumps of cells, like the corpse? There's something fundamentally different. What happens at the moment of death? Or better yet, how do we define death? Decay? Brain activity? Say that again? Soul leaves the body. I would agree with that. theologically and philosophically. Here's how we define death, clinically. The irreversible cessation of the body's ability to function as a coordinated whole. Here's what happens at death. There's an irreversible breakdown of the body's ability to work together. The bodily systems quit talking to each other. And when that happens, it's over. Kondik then goes on to make a very important point. She says the embryo is nothing like the corpse, and here's why. In the corpse, there's been an irreversible cessation of all bodily coordination. The cells aren't talking to each other. The systems have broken down irreversibly. Is that true of the embryo? Now, some people will say the embryo doesn't even have a brain. It doesn't even have a brain. How can you say it's alive? Question, does the embryo need a brain to coordinate all of its systems so that it can be living? No, it doesn't. Do you need a brain? Yes, you do. More mature human beings require a brain to coordinate all the systems in the body. The embryo does not require a brain to coordinate its primitive systems. So just because it lacks a brain does not mean it's merely a clump of cells. By the way, if these cells on the embryo were just isolated, individualistic cells that weren't talking to each other, wouldn't each cell develop itself into an embryo? But instead, these seemingly independent cells all talk to each other and work together, even at the totipotent stage, to do what? Form one single human organism, the embryo. So they're not mere clumps of cells. This is just bad biology. It has nothing to do with the way that things really are at all. Richard Stith has a great way of illustrating this as well. And we're going to talk about Richard Stith, and then I'm going to talk about embryonic stem cell research, and then we're going to take our break. So we'll take an extended break coming up after that. Richard Stith, who's a philosopher, Christian philosopher, says, there's a reason why so many people today do not get it that embryos are whole human beings. He says they think of human embryos as something that is constructed part by part rather than something that develops from within. And that mistake in their reasoning causes a lot of people to think our view is counterintuitive. So let me give you an example that Richard Stith points out. Well, let me just use his to make my own example here. Let's take a journey. Let's go about 1,900 miles east to Bowling Green, Kentucky. Anybody know what automobile is produced in Bowling Green, Kentucky? I'll give you a hint. You would all want one. Okay. Corvette. And you can go, you been there?
No, my dad picked up his Corvette for me.
What a guy. What a guy, man. He didn't go to the dealer. He went right to the source. My father-in-law is 77. He buys a new Corvette about every 5 years. Surfs, skis, has 2 Harleys. The guy's insane. What that had to do with what I'm about to say was my personhood level just dropped. Richard Stith says the problem is people confuse construction and development. So let's go to Bowling Green, Kentucky. We are looking at a Corvette being put together piece by piece. Would we say that a Corvette is present when the first 2 metal plates are welded together? No. Because those 2 metal plates could be what? Something completely different, right? We might build a boat. We might build a wrought iron fence. I don't know. But you don't have a Corvette there. How about when the frame is welded together? Most of you are still saying no. How about when we add the powertrain? Motor, transmission, rear axle? It's getting close for me. How about when the body is attached to the frame? Some of the guys are going, yeah, I can see that. Some of you might say, no, I'm not going to say it's a Corvette until the wheels make functional contact with the road or the ground. Okay. Here's my point, though. Nobody in this room is going to say you have a Corvette when the first 2 plates are put together, and rightfully so. But then Richard Stith makes a very good point. He says an embryo is not like a car that is constructed part by part from the outside. Because embryos do something that no constructed thing like a car has ever done. They develop themselves from within. There isn't an outside builder putting them together piece by piece. The development for that embryo is programmed into it, and from the beginning, it is directing its own internal development. Have you ever driven a car that built itself? That's the difference. Embryos are not part things that are constructed piece by piece. They have an inner nature that drives their development, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. They are fundamentally different in kind from something that's constructed. Richard Stith gives another example that I think will help us here. He says, imagine that we're out on a safari and we're in a jungle somewhere over in Africa or wherever jaguars are. I don't know what part of the world they're in, but we're in that place wherever they are. And we're out on a safari and we're walking along a trail, and all of a sudden you see a black jaguar leaping across the trail in front of us. You know how rare black jaguars are? They're rare. And you just happen to have, at that moment when that jaguar jumped across the trail, you just happen to have a Polaroid camera. Remember those old Polaroid cameras? I don't even know what they were called, but when I was a kid, you would snap a picture and it would poop the picture out. You'd wait about a minute and then it would gradually emerge. Anybody remember what those were called? Instamatic. Okay, Instamatic camera, that's what it is. Thank you. You take that picture of the jaguar jumping across the trail, and you are stoked because you know how rare these pictures are to have one of these. And while you're waiting for the picture to emerge, I come up to you, I rip the camera out of your hand, I take the film, rip it out, and I tear it up. Are you going to be outraged? You're going to be outraged. Is it going to help my case a bit if I look at you and say, what are you upset about? There was no jaguar, that was just a brown smudge on a piece of paper. Dare I say you'd be incredulous? You would say to me, what do you mean there was only a brown smudge on the paper? The jaguar was already there, we just couldn't see him yet. That, says Richard Stith, is the true understanding of human embryology. The embryo is all there. It has yet to mature, has yet to grow, but it's all there from the very beginning, internally directing its own environment and growth. Another way to look at this, Stith points out, is he says, our intuitions about this change dramatically when we look back rather than forward. And here's what he means by this. Imagine you go to your favorite uncle's home, we'll call him Uncle Bill, and there on the table at Uncle Bill's house is a picture of what looks like a small ball of 10 cells that's been blown up so you can see it. And you look at that and go, Uncle Bill, what is that? He says, well, that was me when I was an embryo. You'd look at that and go, gee, Uncle Bill, you weren't any better looking then than you are now. Dude, what's up? You would not say, oh, that's just a clump of cells. You would say, that's you. You'd have no trouble with your intuitions connecting with that being, the same being that's standing there in the dining room. It's when people look forward they have trouble. But if we could look back, it'd be a whole different game. That's the basic case we need to make for the question, what is the unborn? What is the unborn? The unborn are distinct, living, and whole human beings. They're not parts of another human being like a skin cell is, like sperm and egg are. They are themselves distinct human beings. They are not constructed, they develop. And they develop themselves within in a way that no constructed thing like a car or boat or plane ever did. Any questions on that basic science or the objections that some people raise against the pro-life view? Let's talk briefly about embryonic stem cell research, and then I'm going to give you a break. Embryonic stem cell research, which we will abbreviate at times as ESCR, is simply a process that involves using stem cells, allegedly, to treat disease. And let me define my terms just so that we are all on the same page. And again, these definitions, everything's in your notes. Stem cells are fast-growing, undifferentiated cells that are very flexible, that are the basic building blocks of the body. All 210 bodily tissue types come from these primitive cells, and researchers, recognizing their clinical value, want to harvest them to use to treat disease in people who have damaged cells. Embryonic stem cell research is where we take a human embryo, we extract the stem cells from it, which kills the embryo, and then we take those stem cells and implant them in the bodies of people suffering from disease with the hopes that they will get better. That's embryonic stem cell research. The close cousin of embryonic stem cell research, not just a close cousin, a necessary cousin to embryonic stem cell research, is a cloning procedure known as somatic cell nuclear transfer. Now, why do you think we need cloning? Before I define this procedure and describe it for you, why, just off the top of your head, do you think cloning and embryonic stem cell research are necessary cousins, as I put it?
The DNA will match the person that would receive the...
Precisely. What's one of the big problems in medical clinical treatment when you're taking body parts from one person and putting them in the body of someone else? Rejection, right? You have problems. The DNA isn't working together. They're fighting with each other. Where I come from in Atlanta, we have these nasty things called fire ants. I don't know how many of you have ever seen fire ants, but they make these red mounds, and they're all over your grass, and I love going to war with them, and I love to torture them. So, you know, they tell you, oh, don't disrupt the mound. Are you kidding me? This is fun. I'll take a shovel. I'll go get a pile of fire ants from this mound over here, walk to the other side of the yard, and dump it on that one. They fight each other. It's a war. They do not like each other. Well, you got that same kind of thing going on here, okay? Look, I know I got to keep you guys awake, so I got to come up with these things. These cells reject each other, and you're exactly right. But what if we had an embryo that we were going to get stem cells from that was a genetic match of you? Voila, no more problem. And oh, we don't have to worry about trying to convince parents to give up their leftover embryos so that we can kill them. You know, we're told that there's 500,000 leftover embryos out there. Leftover does not mean available, because the vast majority of those embryos are still under their parents' control, who don't want to give them up. And unless the federal government is going to coerce them into giving them up, we don't have that many embryos available. So there's a huge shortage of, quote, leftover spare embryos. But if we could do cloning, well, then maybe we could produce more embryos. Here's how cloning works. We take a female egg cell and we vacate its DNA. We then take your donor DNA and we slap it into that vacant egg cell. Then we add electricity and chemicals and start it jolting into reproducing as a clone. This is the same procedure that gave us Dolly the cloned sheep 15 years ago or whenever it was. Normally, you've got chromosomal pairs from parents. How? What normally happens in normal reproduction in terms of the chromosomes? Half and half. In this case, you don't have a half and half. What do you got? It's all coming from one source, right? All 64 from one source. That's the cloning technique known as somatic cell nuclear transfer. I'll tell you in a moment why we're being very precise in defining the terms here, because there's a deliberate effort to confuse the terms out there to justify cloning. So let's make sure we know what everything is. Somatic cell nuclear transfer is cloning. It is. And in a moment, I'll show you how people are trying to deny that. There are people who want to distinguish between therapeutic cloning on one hand and reproductive cloning on the other. And you get people like the president and others saying, oh, we would never engage in reproductive cloning to make a baby. We just want therapeutic cloning to treat disease. Here's the problem. All cloning is reproductive, isn't it? Because all cloning produces what, men and women? a living human embryo. The only question is, how are we going to treat this embryo? Are we going to let it live, or are we going to kill it for research? That's the only question here. The cloning technique is exactly the same in either case. All cloning is reproductive. It's nonsense that we've got therapeutic cloning here and reproductive cloning here, and they're somehow different. That's a sham. It's all reproductive. Just before the break, I want to tell you about the history of our country on embryonic stem cell research, then we'll pick up the rest of cloning after the break. Here's what our country has done regarding embryonic stem cell research. In 1993, President Clinton directed the National Institutes of Health to hold panel hearings on the morality of using embryos for medical research. And the panel concluded as follows. The panel said, quote, or I'll paraphrase the quote, "Embryos deserve profound respect, but they can be killed for research." Listen, as Daniel Callahan put it, he said, "I've always felt a bit uneasy about telling someone they had profound respect and then killing them." This is what the panel determined. And they justified not cloning, but using embryos that were left over in fertility clinics to derive stem cells. That was the conclusion of the NIH panel in 1993 that was directed by President Clinton. In 1996, the Republicans in Congress said, wait a minute, this is nonsense. This idea that we profoundly respect embryos, but we're going to kill them for research. And Congress responded by passing what is known as the Dickey Amendment. The Dickey Amendment said you cannot use federal tax dollars to destroy embryos for research. That seemed to settle the issue. But in 2000, the Clinton administration thought, we can get around this. We'll allow human embryos to be experimented on using tax dollars, but we won't use tax dollars to kill them. We'll use private funds for that. Let's think about this for a moment. As Douglas Johnson pointed out, if someone was killing porpoises for the purpose of research, and they claimed that they would use federal money to do the research but not kill the porpoises, would we buy that line of thinking? Killing of the embryos is integral to the research. You can't separate it out. And so Congress passed the Dickey Amendment, and Clinton tried to get around it by saying, fine, we won't use federal money to kill embryos, we'll just use it to research on them after the fact. However, Clinton never got around to implementing his policy. So George W. Bush takes office in January of 2001, and on August 9th, he announces to the nation his policy on embryonic stem cell research a few days before September 11th. And here's what he said. Federal tax dollars will not be used to kill any embryos. Furthermore, federal tax dollars will not be used to experiment on any embryos. However, for those embryos that have already been killed prior to August 9th, 2001, federal money will be allotted for doing embryonic stem cell research on those stem cell lines already in existence prior to August 9th, 2001. Everybody clear on what the policy was? People have said, well, George Bush banned embryonic stem cell research. No, he didn't. He was the first president to fund it. He did not ban it. The Bush policy was it did not fund embryonic stem cell research, at least in terms of ongoing research, but it also didn't ban ongoing research. You could use all the federal money you wanted to do embryonic stem cell research using rats and mice. You just couldn't use it to kill embryos. Well, fast forward, 2009, last year, President Obama. He announces that there would be new directives and that now embryonic stem cell research lines would be increased and federal dollars would be available to conduct research thus reversing the Bush policy and reverting back to what in essence was the attempted Clinton policy of we won't use the money to kill the embryos, we'll just use it for the research. Well, guess what happened 2 days after Obama announced this to the public? Guess what he signed back into law? The Dickey Amendment, which does what? Bans the use of federal money for what? Killing embryos for medical research. Last month, a federal judge stepped forward, and that federal judge, by the name of Royce Lambeth, stepped up and said, as long as the Dickey Amendment is in place, you can't use federal money to kill these embryos. You've got to get Congress to change its policy. So that's why you heard in the news a few weeks ago that a federal judge had stepped in, and of course the liberal media said, oh, where's that judge? How dare he? What a terribly reasoned opinion. No, all the judge did is enforce the law, the Dickey Amendment. Yeah. So that's where we are right now. Well, let's resume. What I want to do is I want to continue with our overview of embryonic stem cell research so that you can understand what's at stake. And what I want to do now is talk about the morality of embryonic stem cell research. Is it okay? And what do you think our primary question is in determining whether it's okay? What is the embryo? Just like we started with when we were talking about abortion. What is the unborn? Is it a human being like us or something else? That's the moral question. Of course, there's going to be people who argue that embryonic stem cell research should go forward. We've already talked about a few of these. Here's the kinds of ways they justify it. These embryos are going to die anyway. Well, yes, they are. And why are they going to die? Because we want to kill them for research. Second thing you're going to hear is that, well, we have got a situation where these embryos can't survive on ice. Therefore, we ought to use them for research. It's less of a direct claim that we're going to kill them, but it is nonetheless the belief that we can't sustain them on ice. Therefore, we might as well put them to good use. Let's test this for a moment. Are prisoners on death row going to die anyway? Do we cut their bodies up and use them for medical research? No, we do not. So, well, yeah, China, maybe, yeah. Barbaric, yeah, in China. Soldiers who are mortally wounded on the battlefield are going to die, but we don't slit their throats. We make them as comfortable as possible until they die from their injuries. Let's use a thought experiment here. You are running a Cambodian orphanage. You have 200 toddlers in your possession who are under the age of 5, and your ability to sustain them is fast ending. You are at critically low supplies of water. You have no medicine. Kids are already sick. Some are starting to die. And by next week, you're going to have no food. It's only a matter of time before they're all going to die from starvation or disease. And you know this. An enterprising scientist approaches you, however, with a proposal. He offers to take all of the toddlers off your hand, and he says to you, you know, these kids are going to die anyway. We could use their organs to treat disease in other people. I'd like to take them off your hands, and I'm going to kill them since they're going to die anyway and use their organs for transplanting into people who have a better chance at survival. Now, I suspect that every one of you, as would I, even though we would be powerless to prevent these kids from dying, we would never be a partner to the deliberate destruction that this doctor is proposing. We would never say that because we can't save these kids, we'll therefore turn around and give them over to be deliberately killed to benefit other people. But that's what's being done with embryonic stem cell research. People say these embryos are going to die anyway, we might as well put them to good work. What do you think they're really assuming about the embryos when they make this kind of claim? that they're not human, because they would not argue this way if we were talking about 2-year-olds in a Cambodian refugee camp. But they will do it with embryonic stem cell research because of what they're assuming about the embryo. The next claim you'll hear to justify embryonic stem cell research is what we heard our president say when he went on air a year ago, a little over a year ago, to argue for the funding of embryonic stem cell research. I'm going to paraphrase his argument for you, not his actual words, but the argument. We should not let ideology hamper science. Science needs to be unhinged, uncuffed from ideology that prevents people from being cured. Anti-science attitudes are not going to cure anyone. That was the gist of his argument. Not once did he make any attempt to argue that the embryos were not human. Not once did he make any attempt to argue that even if they are human, they have no moral value, hence we can kill them. Instead, he simply said ideology must get out of the way of science. Now, help me out here. What's the first thing you know when you hear a statement like that? What kind of statement is this? Ideology should not get in the way of science. An ideological statement. So his whole claim self-destructs. It's a self-defeating claim. It's like saying, as Frank Beckwith says, my brother is an only child, or I can't speak a word in English, or the Dodgers are going to win the World Series anytime soon. You know, something that can't be true. You know, it's really hard living in Atlanta and being a diehard Dodger fan. I mean, I stay up to watch games. It's 1 o'clock in the morning and there goes another blown save, you know. You go to bed grumpy, get to bed at 4. It's wonderful. But when you say we shouldn't let ideology get in the way of science, what are you doing? You're getting ideology right out there with your own statement.
I was actually thinking it's scarier than a self-defeating statement because it's not technically self-defeating. What he's asking is that no ideology interfere with science, or block it. So it's almost as if science now gets to trump everyone's ideologies.
But wouldn't that also be an ideological statement that science should trump ideology? I mean, I agree with you. You're making a little finer distinction than I am, and that's true. But he is engaging in a metaphysical claim about the nature of science that is inherently ideological. Somebody had a hand up over here. Yeah.
What if the better word was religious statement?
Say that again.
What if he used the word religious statement?
We shouldn't let religion get in the way of cures? He didn't say that, if I remember correctly, but others have. For example, Ron Reagan, son of President Ronald Wilson Reagan, at the 2004 Democratic National Convention, gave a primetime speech on embryonic stem cell research, and I'll paraphrase it for you. He basically said, there are many well-intentioned people of faith who have a theological view that this research is wrong, and although they are genuine, although they are entitled to their belief, the theology of the few should not get in the way of cures for the many. So he was making it religion, but notice even he can't escape this, and I'll say more about it later, but he went on to argue that the embryos don't count because they don't have fingers and toes, they can't feel anything, they can't see anything. At that point, he is entering a realm known as theological, philosophical anthropology. It's a big string of words, but he's making a claim about the nature of human beings and their purpose in the universe and what gives them value that is inherently a religious statement. Yeah. So he couldn't escape his own claim that metaphysics needs to get out of here. It's something we're going to talk about in detail tomorrow, that there is no such thing as metaphysical neutrality, though people try to pretend there is. And so Ron Reagan did use exactly what you brought up, a religious claim, or a claim to say religion needs to stay completely out of this. That's exactly what he was saying. There was in the president's claim also this worldview known as scientism. What's scientism? Help me out.
Is it holding science above anything else?
Science and science alone defines what counts as true knowledge? Yeah, that's exactly right. Science is the full measure of knowledge. All else is I guess, personal opinion. Tony Blair said in 2000, in arguing for Britain's policy on embryonic stem cell research, he said that we cannot let moral considerations get in the way of British science, and we cannot allow our science to end up going offshore because of these moral considerations. Here in the States, Senator Orrin Hatch, who says he's a pro-life senator, and for the most part his record has displayed that, but on this issue has not. He said it would be a shame to say to someone who has an illness that we're not going to cure you because of some abstract ethical principle. Now, both these gentlemen just justified the Tuskegee experiments of the 1930s and 40s, where we took African American men who were suffering from syphilis, we promised to cure them, but instead of curing them, for some of them, a large measure of them, we gave them phony drugs so we could study how the disease killed them. Now, if science trumps morality, what's wrong with that? And the answer is nothing's wrong with it.
I was just going to say, how could they argue the Nazi Germany experiments and all the things that they did in the name of science? Everyone shuns away from that and says, that's wrong, that's wrong,
Yeah.
wrong. It
Yeah.
seems like they're going down that road.
Yeah, that's right. Because if you say that science trumps morality and that no moral consideration should trump scientific ones, what's wrong with killing 2-year-olds to prevent disease in 5-year-olds? Why do we have to limit it to stem cells from embryos? Why not use anybody we want that will cure those that we determine to have value at the expense of those that we don't value? So yeah, that's a huge problem.
I think there is, though, like a system of ethical reasoning that, say, Peter Singer subscribes to, namely utilitarianism.
Right.
Where they could say, and in that system there are no intrinsic goods. It's just that one principle.
Right.
To maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. So they could appeal to that, let's say, and be moral or engaging in moral reasoning.
Well, you're right that they could. A utilitarian, to repeat what he just said, very thoughtful observation, that utilitarianism could come along and say, well, it's just the greatest good for the greatest number. But there is a problem with utilitarian thinking, and that is, what is the good? Utilitarianism by itself can't define the good. You've got to use some other deontological system to make that determination. And that's why utilitarianism ultimately, I think, fails. It can't tell us what the good is. It becomes very subjective. We're going to get to Singer, as a matter of fact, in just a minute here, or a few minutes here. I'm going to save Singer and Boonin and Steven Pinker, the really tough guys, till our last 30 minutes of class when you're all comatose. And all right. Very quickly, you will also hear that embryonic cells are more effective than adult cells and iPS cells. That's simply false. Embryonic cells right now are not treating in clinical trials anyone that I'm aware of. There's been a proposal to introduce a treatment using the cells, but I don't think it's cleared the necessary hurdles that need to be cleared. But nevertheless, that is what we are being told. Meanwhile, adult stem cells are treating 75 to 100 known diseases and doing it without having to kill a donor to get it done. We don't have to kill you to do adult stem cell research. Adult stem cell research is treating everything from cancer to neurological problems. We can take bone marrow cells from an adult donor, implant them in the brain, and guess what those cells become? Nerve cells that treat disease in the brain in some cases. So we don't have to kill embryos to treat ourselves. Dr. Rae mentioned something last night that is interesting and exciting. He mentioned what is known as iPS cells, induced pluripotent stem cells. This is where we take an adult cell and we trick it into functioning as an embryonic one. In essence, we revert it back so that it regains its flexibility that it would have in an embryon as an embryonic cell would. Truth be told, they're still working out the kinks in this research, but it does represent a very exciting frontier. Question though, do you think that has silenced the advocates of embryonic stem cell research?
No.
So is science really in play here, or is it ideology? It's ideology. What this battle's really about is, what is the embryo? That's what's really going on.
So there really is no scientific argument for why they would want to use embryonic cells as opposed to adult cells?
At the moment, there is a scientific argument that says the embryonic cells are more flexible, and they appear that we can use them in a wider variety of contexts. However, the flip side of that is, although the cells are more flexible, we can't control them once we implant them, and they have a tendency to form tumors. We also have a problem with them being rejected by the donors, which is why we would need cloning. And if we go the cloning route, we've got to secure female eggs, which is a hugely expensive procedure and risky, I might add. These young women who respond to these ads in school, in college newspapers, they're putting themselves at risk. It's not an easy procedure. Most of the time, the woman is put under general anesthesia or given some kind of sedative. It's not an easy thing, and it's hugely expensive. Just to get one stem cell line from a cloned embryo would probably require upwards of 100 eggs to just get it successfully going for one, at a cost of anywhere from, I think it's $1,000 a piece, something like that. I mean, it's crazy. I could look those notes. Look at my notes. I've actually got it in the notes with a footnote to the source, so you can check me out on that. So yes, and you bring up a good point, Hope, and that's this. We do need to be careful as right-to-lifers that we do not overstate our case. Oh, embryonic stem cells will never work. They might, folks. Yeah. They might overcome these problems. So what does our primary argument need to be? Prudential or moral? Moral. We've got to be able to argue that these are living human beings that have intrinsic value. It's not enough to just say, well, right now the embryonic treatments aren't working. Right now they're not, but that day could come. And so we better have our stuff together on the apologetics front to argue that way. Yeah?
What's a stem cell line? What's the line? We hear that all the time. I don't know what it is.
I'll give you my best understanding of it and will confess that I do not fully understand because the term is used so loosely that I am trying to get my hand around it. It's basically where we take a stem cell line would be where we have a family of stem cells that we derive treatments from that are enough alike that we can use them in a clinical setting. Now that's my best guess of this, but that's my basic understanding of it, and I'm willing to be corrected. I could be wrong on that, but that's my understanding of it. Okay, let's talk briefly about what we need to stay focused on with embryonic stem cell research before we move to our next topic. Here's what you need to stay focused on. Number one, we're not opposed to embryonic stem cell research per se. What are we opposed to? Killing embryos to do the research. We're also not opposed to stem cell research per se. What are we opposed to? Destroying embryos for research. Secondly, somatic cell nuclear transfer is cloning. And I want to warn you, everybody on the other side is trying to convince everybody else it's not cloning. In Missouri a few years ago, a group called Missouri Cures came out with what they said was legislation to discourage cloning. Instead, it would write into the Constitution of Missouri a right to do embryonic stem cell research, which it ended up passing. But before it passed, all over the group's website, Missouri Cures website, there was language that said, "We oppose cloning." And then a paragraph later, it would say something like, and this is all in your notes, you can look up the exact language that they used. They'd say something like, "We oppose cloning," and then right after that, "but we support all kinds of research, including somatic cell nuclear transfer." What is somatic cell nuclear transfer? Cloning. So they were talking about out both sides of their mouths. I mean, the deception was breathtaking. But they sold it. They sold it because people didn't know what was really going on. And they used misleading language and deceptive language and got away with it because the public did not understand that. All cloning is reproductive. Do not buy the distinction between therapeutic and reproductive. And then finally, embryos don't come from stem cells. They have stem cells, and researchers want to kill them to get the stem cells. These are the main things to keep in mind. Here's a quote that's in your notes that you might want to memorize. It's from Hadley Arkus. He says, given a choice between a therapy that is lethal for human subjects and one that is not lethal for human subjects, wouldn't we be inclined to choose the non-lethal treatment, especially when it's vastly more effective at treating disease than the lethal one? Now, I think that's a great soundbite, and it resonates with people. So that's something you can look up in the notes and commit to memory. Hadley Arkus. He's the guy that wrote this book, Natural Rights and the Right to Choose. Okay, any questions on the science of our view? Yes?
What is an adult stem cell?
An adult stem cell is a building block cell, but it's not as flexible as an embryonic one. It is differentiated. What happens is when cells start out, they can be any kind of tissue. When they're in the embryonic stage, embryonic cells, the reason researchers want them is they believe they can be any kind of tissue for the body. We can use them and implant them and they'll become whatever we need them to be. Adult stem cells have started to differentiate, meaning their programming is kicked in and they're headed to determine to be a certain kind of cell, and therefore it's a little more tricky to get them to be something else, though we are able to do that to some degree, as we mentioned with the bone marrow and nerve cells. The problem, of course, is while they're more flexible, they're also tough to control, and they have not yet figured out how to fix that problem.
How do you get an adult stem cell? Where does it come from?
A bone marrow donation, something like that.
So I can give someone an adult stem cell.
We'd probably take it from you and put it in you. But yes, technically you could. But we still have a tissue rejection issue to deal with. So preferably they want to take it from you and use it for you.
Is umbilical cord blood stem cell?
Cord blood is stem cell therapy, yes. And
Would that be considered from the baby or from the parent?
it's from the placenta. It's fine. There's no problem. We're not killing a child. Yeah, it's adult stem cells. Yeah, we're not killing anybody to get it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, let's change course. We've talked about science. Now comes the fun part, philosophy. And this is where, how do I put this? All heck breaks loose. And this is where it really, really gets heated and where we've got to know our stuff. Scientifically, pro-life advocates argue that the unborn are distinct, living, whole human beings. Philosophically, here's our argument. And again, I'm going to put it in one sentence. Our scientific argument in one sentence, our philosophic argument in one sentence. And again, in your notes. Scientifically, the unborn are distinct, living, whole human beings. Philosophically, there is no essential difference between the embryo you once were and the adult you are today that would justify killing you at that earlier stage of development. Are there differences between embryos and adults? Of course. That's not the question, though. The question is, are those differences morally significant such that we can say it would have been okay to kill you then, but not now? And as Stephen Schwartz points out, there's only 4 differences between that embryo you once were and the adult that's here today. And not one of those 4 differences matters such that we can say killing you then was fine, but not now. Schwartz says there's a difference of size, there's a difference of level of development, there's a difference of environment, meaning where you're located, and a difference of degree of dependency. Think of the acronym SLED, and you'll remember these 4 differences. SLED, size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency. We have found in our organization that this little acronym is one of the most effective ways to convince people that there's no essential difference that justifies killing that embryo. In fact, we have SLED cards up here with it written out, and it's in your notes too, of course. Have I mentioned the notes yet? And have I mentioned that book? They're in both. But here's how we use that SLED acronym. We use it to show that the differences between the embryo and the adult are not sufficient to justify killing the embryo. Size, there's your S in the SLED acronym. You were smaller as an embryo, but since when does body size as a matter of principle justify killing you? Men are generally larger than women. We don't think men have more basic rights than women do. What about your level of development? You were less developed as an embryo than you are now, but we don't think that 2-year-old girls who are less developed than 18-year-old young women have less of a right to life simply because the 2-year-old, for example, does not have a functioning reproductive system yet. Does it follow we can kill the 2-year-old, or that the 2-year-old has less of a right to life than the 18-year-old simply because she's less developed? I often remark to high school audiences when I talk to them. I say to the high school kids, you are less developed than your parents. You are less developed than your parents physically, and you're less developed than your parents intellectually, which comes as a complete shock to all of them. But the truth is, you don't reach your intellectual peak until your mid-40s. Does it follow then that the parents have a greater right to life than the kids? Absolutely not. I know some of you are looking at me going, wait, you just hit 50. You're on the backside of that slope now, aren't you? Be careful. Size, level of development. What about environment, where you're located? You were once in the womb, now you're out. But how does where you are determine what you are? Senator Orrin Hatch, in defending embryonic stem cell research, said, anything conceived in a petri dish is not a human being. Excuse me, Senator Hatch, how does where you are determine what you are? When you roll over in bed at night, you change location, but you don't stop being you. When you walk from the parking lot into this classroom, you change location, you didn't stop being you. If that's true, how does a journey of 8 inches down the birth canal suddenly transform you from non-human, non-valuable entity that we can kill to valuable human one that we can't? The answer is it can't. If you weren't already human and valuable, you're not getting there by changing your address. And finally, degree of dependency. You once depended on your mother for survival, but as a matter of principle, how does depending on another human being mean you have no right to life and we can kill you? Conjoined twins depend on each other's organs for survival, don't they? Does it follow we can kill the twins because they can't live independent of each other? Size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, think SLED. Those are the only 4 differences between that embryo you once were and the adult you are today, and not one of those 4 differences justifies killing you at that earlier stage of development. That's our pro-life case. Scientifically, we are distinct, living, whole human beings from the very beginning. Philosophically, there's no relevant difference between the embryos we were and the adults we are today that justifies killing us at that earlier stage, and we use the SLED acronym to demonstrate that. You can make a case for your view, even going through the SLED acronym, in less than 5 minutes. So next Sanctity of Human Life Sunday, when the pastor is going to give a pro-life for 5 minutes to make his case for the year, or her case, I want you to be up there making that case. And I want you to pull out that SLED acronym and do it.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.